everyone. Welcome back to another edition of Spilling the Tea on GovCon. I'm Teresa Moon, Director of Business Development for Parabolis. We provide a better financial partnership for government contractors that includes a line of credit to fund your growth. The purpose of this podcast is to assist small businesses with success in the federal marketplace by introducing them to industry experts and resources that they may not otherwise know about. Today's special guest is no stranger to this show. He was actually my very first guest on Spilling the Tea, and we are welcoming back today Steve Koprince. Welcome, Steve.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Teresa. Fantastic to be back with you. Quite an honor.
Well, thank you. You've always been so gracious to me, so I am so excited to have you back. And I'm proud to show you how far this little old show has come since the last time you were here. Many of you that are listening today may already know Steve is a very, very well-respected GovCon attorney. He's the founder of a law firm, a well-renowned academic on many subjects pertaining to small business engagement with the federal government, and one of the most prolific writers in our industry. So, a couple of years back, I started LinkedIn stalking you. Like I say a lot about people that I have on this show, and was learning from you, reading your blogs, reading your books. I followed your guidance back in the day. That's helped me very much along the way. And you've always been so gracious to me. And I love that you're back here again so we can talk about a new journey that you've started recently as well. So if you wouldn't mind, share with our listeners some of your background, what you're doing today, and we'll take it from there.
So yeah, I spent about 16 years as an attorney focused exclusively on federal contracts. Founded a law firm called now Koprince McCall Potroff LLC, which is dedicated exclusively to federal, mostly helping small and mid-sized businesses in that space. And eventually, I decided I want to do some other things. So I've sold the firm to, and I've moved into more of an educational role, which is always something I enjoyed a lot when I was practicing law. I would still travel around the country and go to conferences and do a lot of work. Educating folks through the blog posts and even with online courses. And so now I'm with GOVOLOGY, which is an entity that focuses primarily on online training. A lot of contractors, I'm sure, have heard of that. They work a great deal with the PTACs, Procurement Technical Assistance Centers around the country. A lot of those PTACs, by the way, if you're a contractor, a lot of PTACs have subscriptions to GOVOLOGY. And so their PTAC clients are allowed to see all the webinars that are out there, or you can sign up for those on an individualized basis. So we do the webinars for GOVOLOGY, do some blogs and a few other consulting things as well in the field outside of that on the education side. And then I'm, honestly, I'm spending more time with my family. I'm doing volunteer role. I'm on a couple boards and nonprofits and helping folks who are less fortunate, which is a really great way to give back that I really didn't have as much time for when I was practicing law. So, the time is filled up as it does, not just sitting on the couch, but the combination of government contracting still, but honestly less than it was when I was running a law firm for all those years. And then other things that are, I think where I can bring my experience and knowledge and passion to the table and dedicate some time in the volunteer world and helping those less fortunate, which I, again, like I said, I've that got put on the back burner for a while. It's really heartwarming for me to be able to do that now.
I love that, and I definitely, before we close out today, I want you to highlight some of that work that you're doing so that people know that if they can support you and the causes that are important to you as well. I'd love for you to be able to share that too, and I think that that's so wonderful. And so, hey, it's good to fill your time now with doing good. And you've always been great with sharing the advice through, your legal expertise. And I know that today's conversation has a lot to unpack. So we're going to go ahead and dive in now. When we were chatting about stuff, we had a couple of different topics that we were floating around, but your expertise, heavily leads towards assisting companies that are doing different certification avenues. And so this first question is that the SBA recently announced some significant changes to the rules governing the 8A program, joint ventures, and some other things, dealing with that. And so what should contractors know about these changes? How, if someone's looking towards any of these programs, what should they know?
Yeah, and there's a lot to unpack there, Teresa. There's a lot to unpack. So this is what I would call by SBA kind of a catch-all rule, and it's almost a little misleading because I know most contractors are not out there, and I believe me, I know because I worked with over 1,000 contractors in my career. And you're running a business; you don't have time to be reading every document that comes out in the Federal Register. And so people like me in my practice kind of did that for you, to tell you what are the important pieces of this. This is an area. This particular rule came out in September. It's a proposed rule, which means SBA is saying, here's what we propose to do. We'd like public feedback, and then we're going to implement a final rule that'll become law. And usually, 95% or more of what they propose is going to become final. So it's not that this is just going to disappear. Most of this is going to become law, although not necessarily all of it or all of it exactly the way this has been proposed. But it's a little bit misleading because the rule, if you're just someone who maybe browses some of these federal government contracting websites and you see a title of a proposed rule, it says 8A program changes. If you're not an 8A contractor or a wannabe 8A contractor, 8A applicant, you're probably going to skip right by them. Like, that doesn't matter to me. But in fact, what SBA has done, it should have been said, the title should have been something like, changes for all of SBA's small business programs, because that's what they've really done. They've packed, I counted at one point, I was going through the rule and I counted more than 50 individual changes that they are proposing to make to the rules governing the 8A program, governing the Women-Owned Small Business Program, Service-Disabled Veteran-Owned Small Business Program, Hub Zone Program, the regular small business and affiliation rules, and then joint ventures. And so there's a lot to unpack there. And so I think the first thing for contractors to know is that if you are a small business who is doing business with the government or wants to do business with the government, or you're a larger business that has small business partners, these proposed rules probably are going to affect you. Some of them, not all of them. Almost certainly not all of them, but some of them are probably going to affect you, even though you may not realize that. So that's the first thing, is to be aware that baked into this long rule, it's about 300 pages, right? And I got to go through this and read, are probably changes that affect most contractors, large or small, in some fashion. And I think it's probably worthwhile to hit some of the highlights of that. We can't go through in our time on spilling the tea here all 50 plus changes, but I'll hit some of the highlights and things contractors ought to know. But the first thing to know is that, and I know this has caught some folks off guard, that this proposal is broader than it appears, that it likely affects, if you're a small business, it almost certainly affects you. And if you're large who does any sort of business, joint ventures, et cetera, with the smalls, probably affects you as well.
Wow. So let's dive in. So give us some of those highlights.
Yeah, and so this is an interesting, so big picture wise, so we'll divide up kind of by topic here, just some of the highlights of the topics. But I think big picture wise, large, people say, well, what do you think of this proposal? I say, well, generally speaking, I give SBA credit. I think it's a good series of proposals. It's not a proposal, it's a series of proposals. Because I think SBA has, by and large, not all the changes are this, but has done two things. First, what they have done is filled in some gaps in their regulations. There are places where the rules are just unclear. And believe me, I've run down these paths before, these rabbit holes, for clients who said, well, what is the rule on XA? And the answer is, we don't know. After spending hours of legal research, we don't know, but here's our best guess. And SBA has actually filled in some of those that I remember writing memos for clients where the answer was, literally, we don't know, but here's our best guess. And I was gratified to find that SBA aligned with my guesses on those cases. Right. But it's filled in some of those blanks. And then what SBA has also done, which I think is also really fantastic, is that a number of places where they have had a policy in place where the rule didn't say one way or the other, but SBA just kind of has an internal policy about stuff, they have written a rule on that. And I think that's important too, because what that means, and I've always believed that to the greatest extent possible, and I say this as a former attorney, you shouldn't need an attorney to figure out what the rules are. You should be able to look it up yourself. And so a lot of these things that were just policy, SBA, you wouldn't know that. You would look up all the SBA rules you want, and unless you happen to have done business with SBA a bunch and just know how they operate, which someone like me did at a certain point in my career, then you wouldn't know. So you call me up, I'm like, yeah, I know the rules doesn't say, but here's what SBA does. But you shouldn't really need that. I mean, you can have it if you want it, but the rules should be as clear as they are to a person of decent intelligence who's decently literate and wants to take the time to read them. And so I think that's great on those things. So and they're beyond that, SBA has made some changes that I think are going to offer both opportunities and risks for contractors that are not just clarifications, but are actual changes to the rule. So let's start with joint ventures. So joint ventures, is one that a lot of folks are doing these days. In fact, almost every day now I'm seeing articles about CIO SB4 or Polaris, and is it fair the way SBA is evaluating joint ventures? And so SBA has done a couple things on joint ventures. One thing that they have done, interestingly, is sort of revive the concept of what's called a populated joint venture. And a populated joint venture is a joint venture that has employees of its own. It has its own employees. A joint venture is all rules a separate legal entity, but for a number of years, all the joint ventures operating under SBA rules, whether those are mentor-protege joint ventures or a joint venture between, say, an 8A and a non-8A small business, those have all been what's called unpopulated. That means you have a legal entity, but it doesn't have its own employees. It essentially performs work through its members. But now SBA said, well, we never really meant to get away with populated joint ventures. In some cases, it's fine if you want to put people in the joint venture entity as employees, but only when both members of the joint venture have the correct socioeconomic certification. That is the socioeconomic certification required by a contract. So in other words, if you have a hub zone set-aside contract, for example, SBA rules would now say, or clarified to say, that if you have a joint venture between two hub zones, that entity could be populated. That joint venture entity could be populated with employees. Now, there have been folks who are still trying to do the populated joint ventures for one reason or another. I've always advised against it, even when it was allowed before most cases. But it is important to know that if you're thinking about that, if you see, and I know there's some articles that have come out from others that are saying, hey, back from the dead, it's like the zombies, hubs, populated joint ventures are back. I wouldn't want you to be the guinea pig for this, because while I overall praise the SBA for its proposals here, the populated joint venture piece is one I've drawn folks' eye to as a potential risk area for two reasons. One, it's only allowed, of course, when you have two companies of the same socioeconomic status. So a mentor-protege can't do it if the mentor is large. And if you have even two hub zones, if that joint venture then, one of them is a hub zone and woman-owned, and the other one is hub zone and not woman-owned, if that same joint venture wants to go after a woman-owned contract, you can't do that if you're populated, because they don't both have woman-owned status. But finally, what I would say, don't be the guinea pig. And I always was telling my clients, if at all possible, I don't want you to be the guinea pig, is that the SBA's joint venture rules are, as far as what belongs in a joint venture agreement, the mandatory provisions are really written around unpopulated companies. For example, they say, the lead member of the joint venture has to do at least 40% of the work. Well, that's impossible if you got a populated joint venture, because the joint venture itself is doing the work. But the SBA has not tweaked the rest of its joint venture rules to essentially allow for the populated format. And so I'm a little concerned that unless they make a change in the final rule to allow for that, people are going to try to do the populated format, but it just doesn't fit with the rest of the It's one area where I don't think SBA totally thought it through what it was doing there. So I would caution folks who are seeing these headlines about populated joint ventures to steer away from that. Another joint venture one that I want to mention, because I saw this a lot in my career as a contracts attorney, and the rules have always been sort of ambiguous. This is one where SBA filled in the blanks, was the question about whether a company can be part of two joint ventures or more bidding on the same contract. On the same contract. And so, and this happens a fair bit. You got a mentor, say, and a mentor under the SBA's program is allowed to have up to 3 proteges. And so sometimes you'd have the mentor bidding with JV1 on the, some IDIQ contract perhaps, and also bidding on with mentor number 2 on the same contract. And SBA has stepped in and said, you can't do that. It said the same company cannot participate as a member of a joint venture in 2 or more joint ventures bidding on the same 8A, STVSB hub zone, or WSB contract. That was kind of my advice to folks too, because there's a FAR clause called the independent price determination clause, which says essentially you can't share your price with another offerer. So if you're participating in 2 joint ventures, the other guys almost certainly know your price. And so I didn't know how you could qualify then anyway. But SBA has stepped in, because I got this question over and over. Hey, how many can we basically bid against ourselves? And SBA has said no to that. So those are a couple areas where I would say on the risk side,
Right.
The SBA has stepped in to clarify that if there was a duty before and some contracting officers wouldn't allow that, bid against yourself scenario, and some would. Now SBA is stepping in and saying you can't do it.
Yeah.
You can't do it. So, I don't want people to think this is just a discussion of risk, though I am going to mention one more before we go. So I do want to mention an opportunity area that SBA has put in for some companies too.
Mm-hmm.
And this opportunity comes for in the woman-owned small business program and the service-disabled veteran-owned small business program. And it's something that I've been pushing for a while and just thought made a lot of sense. And SBA has gone and done it. I'm not saying I'm taking credit for it. I think it's just a good idea overall. So what I'm talking about is, what size do you have to be to qualify for those programs? Well, stands right now to be an economically disadvantaged woman-owned small business, EDWSB, which is a subset of the WSB program, or to be a service-disabled veteran-owned small business. You have to be a small business in your primary NAICS code, your primary industry.
Mm-hmm.
And so you say, well, that sort of sounds like it makes sense until you think about, well, what if I want to bid on a contract that's set aside in a NAICS code with a higher size standard? And where this comes up a lot, and it comes up in all sorts of industries, but it comes up a lot in IT is one. I'm going to talk about construction because that's an easy example.
Mm-hmm.
Let's say that your primary industry is plumbing. It's plumbing, it's HVAC, it's a specialty trade type industry, and your size status there is let's say 16.5, I believe, is the current size status for that specialty trade. And so that's your primary NAICS, and let's say you're a $20 million company. You're a $20 million company. So under the current rules, you cannot qualify because you're not small in your primary NAICS for an SDVOSB certification. Qualify as an economically disadvantaged woman-owned small business. What if you want to bid on a general construction contract that's set aside for SDVOSBs? General construction is a $39.5 million size standard, but you still can't bid it. You're almost half. Your size is about half the size standard, but you still are not eligible for the underlying certification. You can't bid. Meanwhile, there's a company out there whose primary industry is general construction. They're a $38 million business, and they do qualify for the certification. Right. So that's just plain unfair. Right. And that's the size should be not based on your primary industry, but based on, is it an industry that you work in or want to work in? Right. And then you can get the certification so long as you restrict yourself to bidding on contracts that you're small for, right? So, and that is what SBA has proposed to do. They have said, well, wait a second, examples like mine show this isn't fair. So what we're going to do is say, you can qualify for an SDWSB or EDWSB certification, so long as it is an industry that you do business in or plan to, want to do business in. It doesn't have to be your primary NAICS, could be a secondary NAICS. You're listed on your SAM profile anyway as a secondary NAICS. Right. But now you get that certification. Clearly, you still can only bid on ED or SDVOSB contracts for which you actually qualify as small. So if you're that $20 million plumbing company and you get your SDVOSB certification, you still can't bid on plumbing contracts that are set aside for SDVOSB because you're not small. But you can now bid on the general construction contracts. And that presents an opportunity, because I absolutely worked with clients who were in that ballpark where they were very frustrated because they had sized out essentially of their primary industry, but they still had plenty of room to run in another related NAICS code, construction being one. There's some of these IT codes that are kind of broad, up in terms of the size too. And so this is an opportunity for folks who are in that kind of mid-tier section now where they had sized out of their primary and they thought they couldn't ever get this certification even to pursue contracts in other size standards. Now they can. And so SBA so now they can. They will be able to if this rule becomes final as written, and I think it will. So SBA has made, I think, a very positive change there.
Any particular timeline that we're looking at for that, for whether or not this gets pulled through?
Yeah, I would be looking at it probably this spring. SBA had a comment period up. I forget when that had closed. It may be closed now. This rule is proposed in September. I forget. It's usually a 30-day comment period. This may have been 45, and I forget which one it was. I wouldn't expect to see something this year. Usually SBA then goes back. There's a lot of stuff here, so I expect that they've gotten or will get a few comments from the public. SBA, in my experience, is good about going through the comments and responding to them. Doesn't mean that they will agree with all of them. In fact, like I said, they often disagree, but they sometimes do agree. But unlike some other agencies, which I think don't do as good a job. SBA historically, my experience, has done a pretty good job of wading through all the comments they get and saying, yeah, we agree, no, we don't agree, here's why, and really explaining themselves. And so
Right.
that process does mean that their rules tend to take a little longer sometimes to be pushed through. So I'd probably be looking at spring. It would probably be the time frame for this, the likely time frame. But who knows? I've seen them come up pretty fast, faster than I expected. And I've seen, it's been a year now since this proposal happened and still not. And I hope that's not the case here, because there's actually a lot of good stuff in here, like that rule that's been holding people back.
Yeah. And like you said, the clarification that closes some gaps to make things more, clearly stated. I think though a lot of people would like to see that happen in a timely manner as well. So, I mean, this is great information, and there's a lot there. I mean, we also know, SBA is taking over the certification process for SDV OSB now too. So, they're doing a lot. And so hopefully they're not spreading themselves too thin, but I think that they're committed on a lot of different levels to make the language specific enough so that people can, like you said, read it themselves. And if they're of moderate intelligence, be able to do it without assistance. And so that's a plus. I mean,
yeah, it absolutely is. And like I said, a lot of these are ones that I had run across in my career, and I know industry's been, concerned about, or I'm sure the SBA's gotten feedback. So some people are complaining, oh, this is taking them so long to get around this. I'm just glad that they finally did it. I mean, again, I'm not on board with 100% of what the SBA is proposing here. Like I said, I think that, for example, that populated JV thing's a little half-baked, but I think a lot of this shows that they really have had their ear to the ground. They really do care about making their rules more understandable for the average Joe business person who didn't get a JD or doesn't have the budget to be paying somebody to tell them what the rules are, which really, that should be an option for somebody who doesn't want to spend the time themselves. But I would really like, especially when you're talking about small businesses, that they don't have to go out and get a lawyer to understand what the rules are. There is one more item I think I want to mention, just because it's a risk item that I see a lot. And then, I'm happy to talk about any of these other items that are in there as well.
Yeah.
And that's the small disadvantaged business self-certification. So small disadvantaged business self-certification is one of those many reps and certs in SAM. When you go into your SAM profile and you're asked to submit your reps and certs, one of the questions it asks is, are you a small disadvantaged business? And in my experience, a lot of folks check yes when the answer is actually no. That they check yes, they maybe because the owners are minorities, so they think, well, that means I'm a small disadvantaged business. And in fact, there's a lot more to it than just that. Or I even had one person at one point say, well, I feel disadvantaged. I'm like, well, don't we all sometimes, it's like, that's not good enough, and
right.
so, my opinion, and I've talked to others in the field who agree, is they say, a lot of folks don't really understand what that means to be a self-certified SDB. And what it essentially is, if you go look up the rule for what is an SDB, a self-certified SDB, it basically says, look at the 8A rules. It essentially says it's it's an 8A, but without the certification. And there's a few nuances to it, but it's essentially that. So you're talking social disadvantage, you're talking a net worth requirement, you're talking an income requirement, you're talking specific rules in terms of how the company ownership is structured, the management is structured, et cetera. And a lot of folks just simply don't meet the test. And so for the most part, the folks who are checking that box when they don't qualify, nothing's happened to them, even though they are representing something that is incorrect in many cases. And by the way, when you go to SAM, it says you certify that you have read all the underlying rules and know what you're talking about. And a lot of people have not read the underlying rules for this. But what SBA has proposed here in the rule is to allow protests of self-certified SDB, either by the contracting officer or by the SBA itself. And I think that is in tandem with the government's current push to expand SDB prime contracting to 15% of prime contracting dollars, which last year is about 11%. So they're trying to push that up quite a bit by 2025. And I think the mindset here at SBA, and I think it will be the mindset of probably Congress too, as it does oversight of this, and is, well, we ought to be sure that the companies that we're counting toward that 11%, now up to maybe 15%, actually qualify. Protests are a good way to do that, because now we can have challenges to those. So for people who have maybe checked that box in SAM, and a lot of people have, when maybe they didn't fully understand that we're essentially talking about an uncertified 8A,
Uh-huh.
or they don't really know what that all meant. They didn't really read all those rules, which would take a while. This is a good time to go back and take a look and say,
Right.
hey, am I really confident I qualify as an SDB? Because there's going to be more oversight of that. And SBA has proposed one avenue for that. And I also expect as the 15% kind of ramps up in this push toward that goal, that you'll probably see GAO doing audits, investigations, maybe offices of inspector general at
Yeah.
agencies too. So folks who kind of got away with that self-cert, I'd take a second look at that unless you're 100% sure that you qualified.
Yeah. And to your point earlier, you don't want to be a guinea pig on that, right?
No, you don't want to, and you certainly don't want to be like, hey, no, that's cool. SBA, I felt disadvantaged, so I checked the box, because that's
Yeah.
not a good legal defense. Let me tell you that. And they do, like I said, the SAM instruction does say you certify that the underlying. And so, and I know the reality is a lot of folks, this gets a little bigger, kind of
Yeah.
off-source the SAM registration to somebody lower on the totem pole. And I've always said that really needs to be at the the C-suite type level, that SAM registration, so you really are sure that you're certifying these things correctly, because the potential penalties, False Claims Act and such,
Yeah.
are severe.
Yeah. You don't want to go down that route. And I'm sorry, I didn't know isn't a valid excuse. So, or it
Right,
wasn't me.
especially if you can't. No. My assistant did that. Well,
Yeah.
buck stops here, right? I mean, that's what
Absolutely.
SBA is going to say.
Yeah.
So yeah, this is one of those ones where the oversight has been pretty spotty over the years. It's just not been enforced. But as the government ramps this up, SBA is clearly creating now a vehicle for protests of that status. So just something to get ahead of the curve if you've checked that box, to either consider, yep, we did it correctly, or maybe here's some tweaks we need to make, so that if someone does challenge us on that, we're confident we could successfully defend it.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure that there's a lot more that we could talk about as it pertains to this, because we've said that there's a lot here. But I want to talk a little bit more about you and what you've been up to. And how about any new books on the horizon? I've got a couple. I know that you are constantly pushing out information and doing a lot of educational presentations, so I'm sure you're working on something.
Yeah, and so the Koprince McCall Potroff firm, which of course I sold the firm, but before that sale, I had worked quite a bit on an updated, revised, expanded version of our book on joint ventures. And so there's been a lot of changes to those rules. My colleagues, former colleague Shane McCall and Nicole Potroff, also co-authors on that. That was just released a week or two ago, and so they
Awesome.
published that. That's available on Amazon either in print or Kindle. It's $9.99 in print and $7.99 in Kindle. So that has all the ins and outs about how you form a compliant joint venture under the SBA's rules, whether you're going after 8A contracts, small business contracts, HUBZone, woman-owned, whatever. Walks you through all those requirements, common misconceptions, things like that. So that's the latest and greatest in the book department, and I definitely encourage folks to check that out if you're at all interested in joint ventures. Had a lot of wonderful feedback on this expanded second edition already.
Right. Well, that's great. I love that. And in the coming months, tell us about where we can find you. I know you've got some conference presentations that you're going to be doing, and you're a resident faculty member for GOVOLOGY. So if you wouldn't mind sharing what we can see from you in the coming months.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you happen to be a PTAC counselor listening to this, I will be in Washington, D.C. for the fall conference this weekend, and then early next week. So on the 6th, the Sunday the 6th, I'll be presenting with Carol Bernard of GOVOLOGY, 4-hour optional session at the APTAC Fall Conference on creating winning proposals. And that'll take you kind of from cradle to grave, all the way from the pre-proposal stage, doing your market research, all the way through award debriefing and kind of starting that proposal cycle back up. So really excited about that talk. And then on Tuesday, the 8th of November at the APTAC conference, we'll be doing a presentation on what we call Construction Contract Compliance 101. That's a breakout session. It's going to hit most heavily on Davis-Bacon Act and how that works, but it's also intended to give folks kind of an overview at a high level of some of the other key areas of compliance that are unique to federal construction contracts, including bonding rules, and different site conditions, all sorts of things that are unique to that environment. So I hope that if you're a PTAC counselor, you'll check those out. If you're not, don't worry, we got stuff coming for you too in December. And unfortunately, I don't have the calendar right in front of me here, but in December with GOVOLOGY, I'll be very pleased. I'm very pleased to be hosting once again, co-hosting this year with my former colleague, wonderful GovCon attorney Nicole Potroff, the annual GOVOLOGY Year in Review, and that is our look at some of the biggest legal changes and developments that occurred during this calendar year, 2022. And of course, we'll be talking more about these SBA rules and a lot of other stuff that happened this year. And so, you go on GOVOLOGY, you'll be able to find the link to that presentation and do that. And please join us. We get hundreds of people every year for that. I've hosted that for years, either solo or with a co-host, and really excited to be hosting that with Nicole this year, who's just fantastic.
Awesome.
And so, yeah, it's going to be exciting. And then coming in January, we've got and potentially bleeding into February. We're just kind of finalizing the dates for that. We've got actually a updated presentation coming on this topic of small disadvantaged business self-certification, because that's a big deal now with this 15% goal. And so we're going to be doing that. And then we're going to be doing a for contractors version of Construction Contract Compliance 101. And so that presentation that's for PTAC counselors, they get it early. But the PTAC counselors are in a different position. This is a train the trainer session for the PTAC counselors. And so we're going to be taking that presentation, breaking it down, putting it back together with an eye of audience toward contractors, and presenting that in the early part of next year. And those will all be available through GOVOLOGY. The way GOVOLOGY works, if you haven't been on that site before or been part of one of our presentations before, you can sign up live, attend the presentation live, or you can attend on demand. Usually 1 week after the live presentation, we have an on-demand session for those who couldn't make the live session. Like I said, a lot of PTACs around the country subscribe to GOVOLOGY, so it's possible that you may actually be entitled to access these for free through your PTAC subscription to GOVOLOGY. And if not, you can buy them on an a la carte basis.
That's awesome. And it's evident by the joy in your voice that you are loving what you're doing right now. So I'm happy for you. And I'm grateful that you came back to share some of your expertise with us.
Wow, thank you so much for having me. It's really exciting, and to see how you've done so remarkably well. Not surprising at all, but excited to see how remarkably well you've done with everything you're doing, traveling around. I know how it feels, but it's great.
I know
it's busy, but it's great, and how well this podcast is doing, because it's it's looking at your lineup of folks you've had on here, man. Well, a lot of great information and advice for contractors out there. So you're doing great things for our community.
Well, thank you so much for saying that. I appreciate it very much. That means a lot to me. And you knew me when, right? You were here from the beginning. So I
should have gotten your
so much.
Then, so I could say, right?
Hey, if you want it, I'll still give it to you.
Fantastic. I'll take you up on that. So
awesome. And I want to offer up to everyone that's listening too. I always have on my desk the book. This is the 8A program one. It's easily digestible reading too. So you don't have to be super smart or have any legal background to understand the way that you break things down. And so I encourage people to go get that joint venture book. And I want to offer it up. If you're interested in this book, you can get it on Amazon. But if you reach out to me on LinkedIn, I'll send a copy of the new joint venture book to the first person that reaches out, because I'm sure it's an amazing resource. I'm going to order it too, because I'm going to add it to my collection. Right. So
fantastic. Well, thanks for doing that. That's awesome. And yeah, we write these. The idea is we're writing about the law, but not like lawyers. And so, we're not writing this like it's a legal brief. It's intended for smart business owners and executives who want to understand a topic, but we know you didn't go to law school, and that's okay. So this is written with examples and all those sorts of things.
And I love it. And I think that's what makes it more palatable for everyone to be able to understand. So I'm throwing that out there. If somebody wants it, be the first one, and I'll send you a copy. But I encourage everyone to get one. I'll be getting one too. We'll have you back on again so we can talk more about things are always changing in government contracting. So I imagine that we're going to have lots to talk about for as long as we want, and as long as we still keep doing this. So
absolutely. I started that blog, Small GovCon, and I was like, man, well, I have stuff to blog about, couple times a week, and as much as I wanted. There's always stuff
Yeah.
going on in government contracting.
That's right. Well, I love it. And I want to thank you again for joining me. We'll have you back again soon. And I want to encourage everyone to log into GOVOLOGY, see Steve in, live and in action so you can see for yourself what it's all about. But check out those archives too, because you can see some of his past presentations there. And I encourage all of you to stay tuned for some upcoming guests. Follow us on our YouTube channel for all of our archived episodes. And keep an eye out for some of the amazing guests that we have in the months to come. We appreciate your support. I am Teresa Moon, and this is Spilling the Tea on GovCon. I hope everyone has a great day.